So, there we go. I'm live. There we go. All right. So, last week, Katie and Lee talked about the first commandment and some of the things that the first commandment talks about us. This week, the section, and if you look at the catechism, I mean, it's the first commandment, the section on the first commandment is quite large, as is all the commandments. It's pretty lengthy, the paragraph sections. In fact, just today alone, I'm trying to break it up. If we were to cover everything, we would cover 38 paragraphs. We're not going to cover 38 paragraphs unless we're going to be here until Tuesday morning. I'm fine with that. We have plenty of chocolate croissants and coffee, so that should be good. And Kay can whip us up something in the kitchen. But I don't think that would be a wise use of our time. But anyway, the paragraph sections go through various things that we are expected to do, right? That's the key thing to remember about the commandments. Oftentimes, they're stated in the negative, but is that all that the commandment is concerned with? And the answer is no, right? Because it's not just what you're not to do, it's also implied of what you are to do, right? So there's a positive movement forward. And it's interesting in this section on the first commandment, and I was mentioning this earlier in the kitchen to Bill, is the fact that in 2104, the first thing it says, as far as our duties, our responsibilities moving forward, is that we are to seek the truth. Isn't that interesting? On the first commandment, right? On the first commandment, which is, you shall have no other gods before me, that when it starts breaking down, when the catechism starts breaking down what some of the responsibilities we are to have, it says this: all are bound to seek the truth, especially in what concerns God and his church, and to embrace it and hold on to it as they come to know it. This duty derives from the very dignity of the human person. Isn't that interesting, right? So we are called to pursue the truth. Now, think about this. On the surface, it might seem a little strange that this is in here. You might think that this section would be covered under the commandment, do not bear false witness, right? And why don't we, don't lie, don't slander another person, things like that. And it does. But in the first commandment, it says we should pursue the truth. In fact, there's more here to read. But on the surface, that might sound an interesting place. But when you think about it, who is God? He's the truth, right? God is the truth. In fact, in John chapter 14, Jesus himself describes who he is by saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. John chapter 14, verse 6, right? So, and I love this line from John Paul II. Truth is not merely an idea. It is a person. The person of Christ. So the truth is a person. So truth is personal. And that's important to recognize. I'm listening to an audiobook on the life of John Paul. And in particular, it's not dealing with his role as Pope. Obviously, you can't distill the fact that John Paul was the Pope. But it's looking at John Paul as the public statesman, right? John Paul as the public statesman. You can't understand the events of the Cold War apart from John Paul II, right? You can't. It's impossible. When he was elected Pope, when he was elected Pope, Yuri Andropov, who was at that time the head of the KGB in the Soviet Union, turned to Brezhnev and said, "You have no idea what has just happened." And then, of course, Andropov became the leader of the Communist Party just a few years later. But it's looking at the life of John Paul as he persuaded people on the political and social stage. Because he would go into these various situations and he had to try to find common ground, right? Had to try to find common ground. Because if you're talking to an atheist, and the Soviets would be officially atheistic, they don't care what John chapter 14, verse 6 says. But they are human beings, and they should care about what it means to be a human being. At least that's what they would claim, right? They claim their system is the system for human flourishing. And so it talked about how John Paul recognized in the Soviet system, even the word pravda. You've heard of pravda? What does pravda mean in Russian? Truth, right. Okay. So they at least claim to want to have the truth. And so John Paul would use that. Well, you claim you want the truth. And so he would try to appeal to them on the common ground of truth. Not on a spiritual level, but on what level? Material, natural, right. Because we all have that in common. And I love how the Catechism goes on to talk about the importance of the human dimension of truth. Because there's two kinds of truth. They don't contradict. Truth is truth. But let's pretend for an argument, for a thought experiment, right? As a Catholic, I'll quote Archbishop Brody. As a Catholic public official representing the church, Archbishop Brody has written about this, he's talked about this, right? On the issue of life. As a Catholic, do I wear my Catholic hat on the issue of abortion? And Archbishop Brody says, no, you don't wear your Catholic hat on the issue of abortion. You wear your human hat. And the human hat is, abortion is the taking of a human life. You don't have to be a Catholic to affirm that. That's not a Catholic position. In fact, I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, Pope Francis is very clear. Abortion is not a Catholic problem. It is a human problem. And it affects the human family, right? Because we have many groups out there that are not Catholic that are pro-life and support the life in the womb, right? Now, as a public official, I am expected to affirm life, to support life, to protect life from conception to natural death. Now, Catholic, what if we have enough Catholics in the Senate, state legislature, and the governor? Nick Saban decides he's going to run for governor and he's going to win. He won't do good in Lee County, but everywhere else, we know, right? So he wins 66 counties probably. But anyway, we all have the Catholics, right? And we all decide to put forward legislation that demands that every citizen in the state of Alabama worships the Eucharist and is to celebrate the Feast of Corpus Christi. Would that be something legitimate for a Catholic politician to affirm? If we go back to the reign of Louis, right? Right? And the answer is no, right? We're not about enforcing the spiritual truth of our faith on the general population, right? So I, as a Catholic, living in this context, would say, no, you are not to support such legislation. Such legislation would be an imposition of my religious convictions, which I believe are more true than even the natural truths, have a higher level of truth, yes. But you don't enforce the truth of the spiritual reality on the general population. But you are obligated to enforce the truth of the natural. Do you see the difference? All right? The spiritual doesn't go against the natural. In fact, St. Thomas Aquinas would say that faith is beyond reason. It's not against reason. It's beyond reason. It's supra. It's past it. But it's never against it. But I can't enforce the matters of the faith upon the general population. Okay? And so it goes on. This is what it talks about. Okay? This is what it goes on to talk about. All right? All men are bound to seek the truth, which we already mentioned. It does not contradict a sincere respect for different religions, which frequently reflect a ray of truth which enlightens all, nor the requirement of charity, which urges Christians to treat with love, prudence, and patience those who are in error or ignorance with regard to the faith. Notice what it says there. It doesn't say other religions are the full truth. It doesn't put them down, but it's gentle. But it says we are to be patient with those who are in error or ignorance with regard to the faith. Suggesting what? That non-Catholic religions, including Protestantism, at some level are in what? There's certain common lines of agreement, right? We celebrate where there is, but there's also areas where we would say as Catholics, Archbishop Brody would say, that they're in error, that there's certain things that they're in error on. But we are to love and support and affirm where we have things in common. That's why you have ecumenical dialogue, right? So it goes on to talk about the duty offering to God. We are required to offer God true worship. However, the social duty, so it goes on to talk about the spiritual responsibility of the first commandment, but then it goes on to talk about the social duty, all right? It says the way that we enforce the spiritual realm is not by public legislation, but by evangelization. The traditional Catholic teaching of the moral duty of individuals and societies toward the church and the true religion comes by constantly evangelizing. The church works toward enabling them to infuse the Christian spirit into the mentality, mores, laws, and structures of the communities in which they live. Okay? So the church is not going to come, though it is attractive, in the 9th century in Poland or whatever, the king becomes Catholic. What happens to the population? Everybody becomes Catholic. In some circles, we can go back to that. That is a prayer intention at some of course, I'm kidding. That's not. Archbishop Brody, no, I'm joking. But that happened, right? When Constantine said it was okay, for people to be Christian, right? We can't deny the impact of that, right? But there's also a danger, and the big danger, I think, and growing up in New York, I see this, right? Everybody's Catholic. What happens to evangelization in a culture where everybody's Catholic? There is none. There's no need to evangelize, right? And so I do think, and George Weigel, I saw it out there in the free book section. I don't know if it's still out there, but if you've never read Witness to Hope, which is the biography of John Paul II by George Weigel, it really is worth reading. It's big. It's massive. But when you're dealing with the life of John Paul II, I don't know how. I don't know how you don't wind up with this, right? Because it's so much in there. And in that book, Weigel talks about the different things that took place, that unfolded under the pontificate of John Paul. But he goes even further. He tells the story of John Paul growing up in Poland, growing up with the threat of Nazism, growing up with communism, what it was like living in the seminary and having to go to different homes each night to kind of hide because of the threat level. Talked about the importance of acting and playwriting. Did you know that John Paul wrote poetry? He was a poet. He was a playwright. In fact, one of his plays was produced for television in the States and was also off Broadway. It's called The Jeweler's Shop. The Jeweler's Shop, right? Actually had a play that was actually put to life. In fact, I believe Margot Kidder, who played Lois Lane in the Supermans in the 70s, Margot Kidder played one of the characters was played by Margot Kidder, and I think she was the one who the fiance was looking at the ring for. And so basically the story is the jeweler, I won't give away the plot, but the jeweler is not an ordinary jeweler. And so the couple comes, and the jeweler winds up teaching them about this whole process of beauty and what beauty looks like. And of course, you know, when the lover and the beloved, right, when you go get the ring, you want to get the best ring you can, right? Because you want to express through this beautiful thing your love, right? So the character, the jeweler in the play, is talking to them about what true beauty is and what true love is. It's Catholic theology, but through the playwright, through writing. Without God being, it's not an explicit story of God and Jesus, none of that, right? But it's a way to draw people into the culture of the faith without being preachy. Does that make sense? Right? And yeah, really, it was quite well done. So Weigel gets into all that, like what was going through his mind when he did that, how he created youth ministry, like the modern youth ministry that we see in the Catholic Church. You could make the argument was first done by Karol Wojtyła when he was a Catholic priest in Poland. You could make that argument. If you think back, as you go back to, you know, a long time, when I grew up in New York with Catholicism, there was no such thing as youth group. We had CYO, but CYO meant you played basketball. Right. Jersey, New York and New Jersey were cousins, right? I mean, right, that's what we did. That was youth. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's really all it was. Okay? You might have had CCD, but the idea, like we had a couple of weeks ago here at Holy Spirit Parish, that we had adoration, Christ in the Capitol, and 3 priests hearing confessions, and 75 teenagers was here, that never happened. Now, I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just saying it just never happened. Okay. In most of the Catholic world, that never happened. John Paul, because gatherings at church were illegal under the Soviets in Poland, guess what he started to do? He started to do, hey, let's go for a hike. Hey, let's go out on the boats. Let's go do canoeing. We're not at church. And we're not talking about church. And they would do all these wonderful things. And he would use nature and being outside and, you know, say mass on the top of a canoe, like literally, okay? That's why Yuri Andropov was very, very scared when John Paul became Pope, because John Paul would never blatantly break the law, but he knew how to use the law and say, hey, we did what you said, but that's not what we meant. Well, but we did what you said, okay? Because he had wisdom, he had prudence, he knew how to work the situation for the favor of the truth, okay? And sometimes we're called to have to do that, right? And so the important thing to recognize when looking at the life of John Paul, I think, is he lives out what this is talking about here in his ministry. He lives it out. Yeah.
There was a TV program, I think it was on EWTN, and I can't remember the title. But what I do remember was he was being interrogated by the KGB. And the interrogator was the same guy who played Poncho in the movie, The Passion of Christ. Remember, the guy who played Poncho Pilot in the movie was the same guy in the film was interrogating John Paul. I I just thought it was kind of.
Yeah, what irony there, right? Bill was just mentioning about how in the life of John Paul, one of the movies, was that the movie with John Voight?
I can't remember.
But the gentleman who played the KGB interrogator in that movie also eventually wound up playing Pontius Pilate in the movie The Passion of the Christ, which is interesting because Pilate famously asked the question, what is truth, right? And who's standing right in front of him? Truth. You're supposed to see the irony there, right? It's just tragic irony, right? Tragic irony, okay? But here the Catechism is saying, look, we're not about enforcing our religion by playing the laws to our favor. We are to do that by evangelization. That's the way forward, right? That's the way forward. The social duty of Christians, us, is to respect and awaken in each human being the love of the true and the good. It requires them to make known the worship of the one true religion which subsists in the Catholic and Apostolic Church. So we have a responsibility to go out and do what? To evangelize, right? That's not a negotiable thing. In fact, the sacrament of confirmation says the confirmed are more strictly obliged to spread the faith by word and deed. It's the Catechism on confirmation, right? Catechism is clear that confirmation is not a graduation from church, which is typically what happens, right? I got confirmed. When's the party? I'm done. See you in 15 years when it's time to get married, okay? No! Like you're called to go evangelize, right? And then it goes on to talk about Christians are called to be the light of the world. The church shows forth the kingship of Christ over all creation, and in particular over human societies. Nobody may be forced to act against his convictions, nor is anyone to be restrained from acting in accordance with his conscience in religious matters, in private or in public, alone or in association with others, within due limits. So, within due limits, right? So you can't be required to act against your conscience. However, it is qualified to a certain extent, right? What if my religion said human sacrifice? Do I have the right to practice that religion? No. I have the right to freedom of religion, to free expression of religion. But I don't have the right to offer human sacrifice. Okay? Within due limits. That's the key thing. So it's not an unqualified right, but you bet. In fact, we just did a radio show the other day on this very topic, and a lot of constitutional scholars are talking about this. You might have just seen in Michigan, the Supreme Court of the state of Michigan just told Governor Whitmer, enough's enough. Enough's enough. I mean, stop playing dumb. When the city of San Francisco says, basically, bars can be at 50% capacity, restaurants can be at 50% capacity, but Catholic churches, not just Catholic churches, churches and religious assemblies can only have one person inside. One person. Really? Are we going to play this game? Really? I mean, seriously? The mayor of San Francisco is going to sit down with Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone. What a great name. I would love to have the opportunity to eat a Sunday dinner with a man named Salvatore Cordileone. It's probably really, really good. But you'd have cannoli, tiramisu, lasagna, manicotti. Oh, unbelievable. Oh, you're killing me. They sit down, and he's going to sit there and he's going to say, okay, here's the deal, Your Excellency. You can only have one person in your church. But if you invite them out to the restaurant, you can bring up to whatever half of what the restaurant can hold. That's ridiculous, right? But it's going on. It's been going on now for months and months since they lifted some of their restrictions. California, I think, has it as 10. Now, each municipality gets it defined. So I think California has it at 10, the state. And I think San Francisco says, well, only one. And then if you're outdoors, I think, was it 25 and under? So outdoors. And Archbishop Cordileone, not just the Archbishop and others, rabbis, okay, other Christian denominations, they're saying this is so arbitrary. And it's been kind of like a political football, but on the issue of the First Amendment, you better be very, very precise, because to take away people's First Amendment rights, to suspend them for no good reason, okay, that's a draconian act, right? We all recognize that, the whole lockdown thing. But at some point, we got to start saying, what can we do and what can't we do, right? This could not happen if we were in San Francisco. What we're doing right now, we got about 20 people in here, okay? We could not do this. But right. You can go, you can serve liquor, you know. But so here's what John Paul would probably do. John Paul would probably be like, oh, good. We're not talking, we might just happen to talk about the catechism, but we're actually just having breakfast today. Right?
Well, the problem is that right off the bat, as a church, we didn't act fast enough. I mean, it should have been the next. I mean, hindsight's 2020.
Right.
But that's when you have the USCCB have an emergency meeting and say, no, this is we're not going to stand for this. And then if you need to arrest us, then arrest us.
Right.
I mean, but we're just so weak. And to your point before, up in New Jersey, I mean, it was so common. You know, a lot of people were Catholic, but that's where we need to re-engage and re-evangelize, because people weren't taught correctly growing up.
Right.
At the church.
Right. What Tom just mentioned, and I'm trying to get better on restating, because if you're watching at home, sometimes when people talk out there. So Tom was just referencing about how, as a church, we probably were a little too docile at first when it came to some of the lockdown regulations, and we assumed goodwill. And in many cases, that goodwill was well-founded in some places. You don't agree?
A couple of decades of experience. There's no goodwill.
That's fair. Okay. Okay. I got rebutted on that, that our goodwill was probably ill-founded. We probably had no good reason to think that the government in many places would be supportive of us. And two states in particular, my brother's a priest in New York, so Cardinal Dolan, these are not his opinions, these are mine. But Cardinal Dolan is now trying to fight with Governor Cuomo to back off, but Governor Cuomo's not backing off, right? It's too late, right? Too late, game over. Hey, you gave us this power. We decide now when you're not going to use, when you could use it. And again, that's part of the problem, which, strangely enough, could be a positive thing for your second point, which is that in the northern states where a lot of people were Catholic, you think Pennsylvania, you think New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, where it's the dominant Christian religion, definitely. This could be an opportunity to re-evangelize, to say, hey, what have we been doing for the last 30 or 40 years? The Archdiocese of New York is a diocese of 2.5 million people. They had one ordination to the priesthood last year. We're a diocese of 60,000 Catholics. We had 3 ordinations to the priesthood. I mean, just do the numbers, right? I mean, we have 23 men in the seminary. New York has about 30. I mean, statistically speaking, New York should have that same number, would almost be like New York having 1,200 men in the seminary.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, you look at the leadership that came from Poland, and how that is like an oasis of the Catholic faith in Eastern Europe, and I mean, it's amazing how things can be done when they're done correctly and by a person who grew up under those regimes and came out and became pope.
Right. The point being about through that, in Poland, for example, a country that lost twice in the war, that was just kind of what was brought up, how in that crucible of suffering and hardship, you eventually have a man who becomes pope. Why? Because the faith could not be taken for granted. And I think anytime the faith is taken for granted, we'd all agree that the faith is going to have an expiration date. Okay? All right. Wait, back there 1 second. Chuck, you had your hand up before.
I was just going to piggyback on what Paul said about exactly what did the bishops do in that diocese of Los Angeles.
Right.
Other than, what did they do exactly? I'm asking you.
The bishops of California ceded to Governor Newsom and the municipalities, and they probably, in retrospect, should not have given such acquiescence. Because now, I mean, it's so obvious that the regulations are being selectively picked. You know, I can go to a restaurant with 100 people at that capacity, put 50 people in there, not have my mask on because I have to eat and drink and all that. But at the cathedral, I can't have mass inside. What a smart virus this must be, right? Must be an anti-Christian virus, obviously, because we got to protect those Christians, and of course we see the absurdity and all that. So, yeah, there could have been more that was done that wasn't done.
Famous saying, if I'm arrested for being a Christian, well, I have enough evidence to convict.
That's a good one. Yeah, it's true. That's so true. If there's ever a crime to be a Christian, will there be enough evidence to convict me? So.
I was going to say, John Paul, when he was using his technique, it was about unity. Remember, solidarity. The father and the whole nation felt on their political muscle had to give way to a unity of the faith. So when he was having those little groups get together and getting the priests together, without breaking the law, he created a unity even that the whole nation couldn't resist. And the Soviets had to walk backwards. They couldn't control it.
Right.
And so, but the other thing that is kind of disturbing when you get a political situation, you get a majority of a group, whether it's California, New York, wherever, they all decide they want to create a law that's in favor of their faith. Eventually, in the future, their faith may become the minority, and they have to suffer the edge of that sword that they create. So
Right.
we have to be careful when we're exerting our influence,
Right.
because only God knows how far. What'd you say, the due limit, or what was the phrase?
With the due limits. Right. And I think that's why, and it kind of touching on the point of, the idea of enforcing one's religion. Well, what happens when that religion no longer is the majority, right? That's always the danger. And I think that's why the church in her wisdom recognizes the danger of imposing through regulation the spiritual truths, which can only come about by personal adherence, right? But on the natural realm, that's why the natural law, we talked about a couple weeks ago, the natural law is so important, right? Abortion or all the marriage, the teaching on marriage, as Archbishop Brody pointed out, is not based on the catechism says blah, blah, blah. It's based on, natural, biological, physiological reality common to all human beings, right? Well, what about the soul? Okay, that's fine. We can talk about when the soul comes in, but that's not where the argument lies, because if I'm a secularist, Nat Hentoff, the late Nat Hentoff, who was a provocateur writing in New York City in the Village Voice, Nat Hentoff was he was not ashamed to say that he was very, very left-wing, okay? Very left-wing. Very anti-Christian, was not a fan of Christianity, was not a fan of Catholicism. But on the issue of abortion, he was as pro-life as Cardinal O'Connor. And he was writing about the issue, like right in the time of Roe v. Wade. Nat Hent. You ever hear of Nat Hentoff? Nathentoff. Nat Hentoff. But anyway, he was strongly pro-life. If I went up to Nat Hentoff, God rest his soul, and said, Nat, you're pro-life because of the soul. He was like, soul? Have you not read my writings or, met me in, person to talk before? You have no idea what I'm saying, right? Because it's common to being human. And that's important, right? So that's why we always have to hold the natural and the spiritual related but distinct, okay? Here's what it says about the right to religious liberty. 2108. The right to religious liberty is neither a moral license to adhere to error nor a supposed right to error, but rather a natural right of the human person to civil liberty. See, that's the natural, right? So the human person by nature has the right to worship God or not. That does not mean, as far as in the eyes of God, that they have that right. That does not mean that in some metaphysical sense, their errors cannot have consequences. Notice, right? It says, does not suggest a supposed right to error. It puts it differently, but it's trying to express the words of Pius IX, error has no rights. But the way it says it is a little different. Would you agree?
It says a difference. It has a different meaning. That's me.
Okay. But when you go to a restaurant and you sit down with your table mates, family, like yesterday, we were eating out yesterday. We went down to Mobile to see our son in his new house. And so the question was posed to a wonderful piece of food in the middle of the table that was ordered by somebody else, but the person who did not order it looked at the person who did order it and said, "You're not going to eat that, are you?" Not, "Do you want that?" Or, "Can I have that?" The question was all the difference in the world, right? And that's how I see this, right? The way, error has no rights, it seems pretty intense, and it's true, but I like how they put it. Nor a supposed right to error, right? So there are some things that are just wrong. Like, they're just wrong. And if you hold to views that say that the human person is somehow less than if that human person happens to be a different color or happens to be from a different part of the world, that's error. Like, you don't have the right. Like, you don't have that right to affirm that and enforce that, right? But how do you legislate someone's thoughts? Right? You have to be careful, right? You have to be careful, right? I love how the late Ed Koch, remember Ed Koch, the mayor of New York? He was originally, before there was Rudy Giuliani, he was kind of the original America's mayor. Ed Koch was always quotable, Ed Koch. But eventually became a judge on the People's Court for a little while. Ed Koch famously said, and I'm sure he was quoting somebody, "You have the right to throw your fist in the air, don't you? You have the right to do that. But where does that right end?" Ed Koch said, "At the tip of my nose. You don't have the right to hit me in the nose. You have the right to throw that." As a typical New Yorker. You always expect a New Yorker to talk about, hitting, like Father George Rutler, who's boxing all the time. But you don't have the right to hit me in the nose, right? I can't legislate you putting your hands in the air like this, but I can legislate you putting your hands in the air like this if it's intended to hit me, right? Can't do that. And that's kind of what's going on here, right? We don't want the church and the state. I certainly don't want the state being the modern day Inquisition. Do you? Except though we're seeing it in reverse, right? You could have 50 people go eat at Luigi's restaurant, but only one person could go inside your church right now. Right? It's kind of the reverse Inquisition happening, right? And I agree. I think it's because we have ceded way too much over to say, yes, okay, you can do this, and almost kind of gave a license to it. Okay, here's what it says. Immunity within just limits from external constraint in religious matters by political authority. So you're continuing that idea about the natural right to civil liberty, okay? But again, there's always these little qualified phrases, within just limits, okay? This natural right ought to be acknowledged in the juridical order of society in such a way that it constitutes a civil right. So, for example, Archbishop Brody points out, under the Soviet Union, did the people have the right to express their religion or their right to worship? One of those is true. That's surprising.
They had the right to worship.
They had the right to worship.
Not to express.
Why is that actually worse? They had the right to worship.
It's confined to a small space.
Right.
Contains it. The Russian Orthodox Church.
Exactly. Under the communist regimes, especially, when you have the Bolshevik Revolution, you have a pretty entrenched Orthodox culture. Lenin would have loved, I'm sure, to get rid of the whole thing right off the bat, and they tried that. But it's kind of like the Puritans after, when they had power under Cromwell, after about, 10 years, people were like, these people are nuts. Christmas, you're going to jail. You can't celebrate Christmas. Okay, well, the idea with the Soviets was, well, how do we kind of placate the people, but yet confine them from expressing their religion? We'll give them the freedom to worship. So you have the freedom to worship. Yes, John?
They're doing the same thing in China right now.
Yes.
And our current Pope is complicit with it. Is if you've been watching the news where Pompeo asked him to make a statement. I believe his answer was, we don't get involved in politics, but yet at the same time, he's all out there about greenhouse gases and save the earth, and et cetera, which is a political issue. But yet we cannot, and Pompeo was talking about the persecution of the church in China, how it's so bad.
Right.
Human rights are so bad, and he asked the Vatican to make a statement. They would not.
Cardinal Zen.
Just issued the new translation of the Bible, like Chinese that destroyed the whole top of adultery. Jesus sent everyone away so he could stone her himself.
Oh my.
Yes.
Yeah, it's true.
Yes. I'm so glad we're offended these guys.
Wait, restate that so I could say that on. That's huge.
Chinese communist translation of the Bible.
All right. We're almost doing like a translation. You're gonna say, and I'm gonna, a new Chinese Communist Party translation of the Bible in the New Testament.
Most of it's exactly the same, except
Most of it is exactly the same, except
the story of the woman taken in adultery.
the story of the woman taken in adultery found in John 8, John 7.
Jesus sends everyone away.
Jesus sends everyone away
So he can stone her himself.
so he can stone her himself.
Because it is, I forget what the exact phrasing is. The moral of it is that it's not so, he would without sin cast the first stone, because that's impractical. Justice still needs to be served.
Right.
So that we can't wait for perfect people to enforce the rules.
And the rationale for that translation, which would be, I think we could all agree, a dramatic mistranslation. But the translation and the justification for it is because the threshold of you can't throw the stone if you don't have a sin is impossible, because you'd have to wait for perfect people to enforce justice. So, the Archbishop Brody points out the danger of the freedom of worship which some people in our own country have said, you have the freedom of worship, but you do not have the free exercise of religion, is because the free exercise of your religion includes the freedom to worship, but goes beyond it and says, I can, in the public realm, bring my faith. I don't have to take the hat of my faith off and put it in the room and act like it's not a part of it. So again, when a Catholic is a Catholic politician, he or she doesn't cease to be a Catholic when they're a politician. It would be an absurd threshold. But what they cannot do, and I would argue their Catholic teaching would not want them to do, is enforce their particular Catholic beliefs. I want every citizen in the state of Alabama to do honor to the Virgin Mary. Do I want every citizen in the state of Alabama to do honor to the Virgin Mary? Absolutely. Do I want to do it by Executive Order 25352? No! I want to do it by the way Father Youngman and Father Gilbreth do it when they work with RCIA and Liz Gregorius and talking to people and sharing with people and saying, hey, have you ever thought about this? Or when somebody asks me, why do you Catholics worship Mary? I can say, well, no, we don't worship Mary. I'm glad you asked, though. And right? But I don't want to do it where like, now you better do hyperdulier to Mary or off with you. Like, no. Okay? No, we don't want that.
That's where we're getting into the thing with the Bible. He says, I believe in the teachings of the church on abortion, and I'm against abortion. But I'm not going to impose my religion on everybody else. And so which is a bunch of hypocrisy, if you ask me, but I mean, it kind of sounds like what you were getting to, according to Father Spitzer, all this goes back to Kennedy, when they got that bishop up there in Massachusetts over to the Kennedy compound, so he could come up with a way of saying he's a Catholic, but he's going to go along with abortion. And he came up with this.
Father Drennan.
Yeah, right. They had to
right.
But I'm not going to go against the will of my constituents.
Right. And so kind of talking about the tension, or the duplicity between, affirming certain things as a Catholic, but then saying you don't want to enforce your religious belief. It just goes back to what Pope John Paul II wrote in Evangelium Vitae, Pope Benedict XVI wrote. I mean, go on. And our Holy Father Francis. I mean, you Google Pope Francis on abortion, and you will see some of the strongest, completely unambiguous language of any of his pontificate. He says abortion is not a Catholic problem, it is a human problem. He actually says this is another one he says. Abortion is like trying to hire a hitman to do your dirty work. Wow, So he's very, very strong on it. But he's very clear that it is not a Catholic problem, because when you make it a Catholic problem, when you make any of those hot button moral issues a Catholic problem, what you've done is you've marginalized it, right? No, it's not. In fact, a letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, he's very clear to point out that the issue of the civil rights for people of color is not reducible to some sect or belief of Christians or whatnot, but rather is tied to the fact that we all share a common human nature. And when you kind of relegate it over here and say, well, but these are our beliefs. These are our beliefs. Oh, well, they may be your beliefs, but they have no rights to be enforced because they're errors, right? They're wrong. That's why it's important to always affirm the natural and the spiritual, the supernatural, right? The natural realm we are to enforce where it can be enforced. But the spiritual realm we can't enforce. At least we don't want that to be the case, because whenever that's a problem, whenever that does happen, it's always going to be a problem, okay? The right to religious liberty can of itself be neither unlimited or nor limited only by a public order, and then it goes on to talk some legal terms, conceived in a positivist or naturalist manner. The due limits, again, that phrase appears a lot in the section, due limits, within reason, right? Because we have to be a little nuanced, right? Which are inherent in it must be determined for each social situation by political prudence according to the requirements of the common good. Not just the good of Catholics, not just the good of Baptists, not just the good of Muslims, not just the good of fill in the blank, right? But the common good, and ratified by the civil authority in accordance with legal principles which are in conformity with the objective moral order. That's the key thing. That's why natural law is so important. That's why what happened over 30 years ago, at least in the public realm with natural law has been called by people who oppose it as Catholic theology being smuggled through the back door. Okay? Here's the problem with that. When Senator Kennedy absolutely skewered Robert Bork, not because Bork was the key thing about Bork you have to understand is Robert Bork was considered a great legal mind. He was on the federal appeals court. That same Senate had appointed him just a few years prior to the appeals court. Okay? But when it came time to him being appointed to the Supreme Court, they attacked Bork not because he was a bad legal mind or he was a bad jurist. Notice the point of the attack. It was on the issue of natural law. Robert Bork's America speech was a speech against the natural law. The effects of that we're still paying today. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. If you do away with the natural law, you do away with Dr. King's argument for the civil rights movement. Because Dr. King hinges the entire argument for the civil rights movement on natural law. He quotes in that letter Aquinas, Augustine, Aristotle, Socrates, all who affirm the natural law. He references other Christian theologians like Niebuhr and so on. Why? Because he actually asks this question. I say that we should support the 1954 decision of Brown and the Board of Education, and yet I say that we should not support and hold these ordinances here in Birmingham. I'm being accused of selectively picking and choosing what I want to follow. Fair question. I'm glad you asked, he says. The basis on which I make the decision to support Brown, and I also make this decision to not support the city of Birmingham's laws, are rooted in natural and eternal law as articulated by St. Augustine, who said, an unjust law is no law at all. Now, you ask me, how do I determine what is a just law and an unjust law? Well, let me quote you St. Thomas Aquinas. And then he winds up defining Aquinas on a just law as any law. Aquinas says a lot on what a just law is, but one of the things that a just law is, it affirms the dignity of the human person. And any unjust law is any law that strips that dignity from a human person. And then he goes, I think it is safe to say that segregation and racism strips the human person of their dignity.
You go to the
But
Jefferson, Locke, John Locke, life, liberty, freedom,
right.
These are, they come from God.
Right. And the key thing is, in touching on this idea, right, the key thing is that if you don't accept what Dr. King does there, then you're only left with subjective and arbitrary enforcement of the law, which is what we just got done saying with, I can go eat in a restaurant of 50 people, no mask because I eat my linguine with clam sauce, but I can't go to the cathedral and go to mass inside. It's completely arbitrary. Okay? And that's the danger when you put to death the natural law. There's so much here. It talks about superstition. It talks about idolatry. I love what Katie pointed out last week. We probably don't in our backyard have animal sacrifices going on. It's a great line. You see somebody raise their hand and be like, well, actually, like, oh! No. But as she pointed out, does that mean we don't create idols for ourselves? Right? We can, right? We can. And oftentimes we do, right? Bishop Barron video. Wow, Bishop Barron's really popular on social media. He got 50,000 views on YouTube. Cat licking, milk out of some container gets like 18.7 million, Well, I don't have time for those Bishop Barron videos, but I sure enough time to watch the cat. Of course, I love cats. We have 2 beautiful cats at home, Zelda and Lucky. Wonderful cats. Wonderful cats. Just wish that they could take care of their own kitty litter. But superstition, right? Well, if I don't touch my hands 47 times, and all that kind of stuff, right? It can be paralyzing to people, right? These are sins against the first commandment. It talks about magic, all kinds of divinization, where you try to divine, spirits, conjuring up spirits, right? All of those things. It actually says consulting horoscopes, astrology, palm reading, interpretation of omens and lots, the phenomena of clairvoyance, and recourse to mediums, all conceal a desire for power over time, history, and in the last analysis, other human beings. They contradict the honor, respect, and loving fear that we owe to God alone. So it condemns all of those things. So don't read the horoscope and base your life decisions on it, okay? And then it talks about atheism and agnosticism, okay? I'll end on this. That John Paul book that I was mentioning earlier on that looks at him as a political statesman. It's by a man named Dr. Paul Kengor, Kengor. He has written so many incredible books. And I have this wonderful, I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but this is what I've been using for my catechism. I've capitulated. I'm using my catechism app. Hey, can't beat them, join them. Thank God the Wi-Fi is working. But Dr. Paul Kengor has a bunch of books. I have also from the public library. Have you ever heard of Hoopla? Hoopla. Have you heard of Hoopla? If you have a Montgomery library card, I think actually this is part of a nationwide thing. But I'll just speak from the Montgomery perspective. My Montgomery Public Library card, which I have, we all have, right? You also get online this app called Hoopla. Now, what is Hoopla? Hoopla has a whole bunch of books that you can get, okay? Ebooks, music, movies, whole bunch. But it also has audiobooks. So if you are familiar with like Audible and all the different wonderful things out there, it actually has audiobooks. And so you can, it has a vast library. Pretty much what's in, if it's been made, then they pretty much have it. Now, they may not get the latest book that came out like last week. They may not get that for 6 months. But they have it, okay? And so it's an amazing app. So Dr. Kengor has a number of books. In fact, Weigel's Witness to Hope is also on the Hoopla app. I can't read it. I cannot read on the phone. I can't. I can read a short little thing. But an audiobook, it's fantastic. You're driving in the car, you put it right in. It's incredible. I got done reading like 4 or 5 books in 1 month. I would not have done that with my schedule with working and all that, reading. But audiobook, when I'm in the car, boom, 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 it's fantastic. So Hoopla, it's an incredible app. But in this book, where he talks about John Paul, the public statesman, he talks about there's three basic reasons why people fall into error. He says the first one, he says, is genuine ignorance. Genuine ignorance. People are truly just ignorant. Second, John Paul says, folly or foolishness. They don't take it seriously. So they make great errors, miscalculations, because they're being stupid, they're being foolish. Okay, folly. And he says the third is malice. Malice. And he kind of quotes, and he kind of used that to try to understand navigating, living the world of Nazism and communism. Because this guy has to think on his feet a lot, right, John Paul? Right? And he says this, and it's a quote from a doctor of the church, but I don't remember who or what. I've heard it before. But John Paul says something like, do not ascribe to malice what can first be ascribed to ignorance or being misguided, right? Which is an important point. He says it helped him because not every official in Poland was acting out of malice. Many were acting out of ignorance. They were just following what? Orders to say, it's what I got to do, right? And just those nuggets. So I would recommend Dr. Paul Kenger on John Paul and anything that he wrote on John Paul or the Cold War is fantastic.
The Pope and the President.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
I've got that if anybody wants to borrow it. And then he just wrote a book, came out like a week ago. It was The Devil and Karl Marx.
Right.
Very good.
Right. Dr. Kenger is one of the world's foremost experts in communism. In fact, he's got a book out called The Idiot's Guide to Communism, which traces the whole history of the communist thought. But there's so much more that we can say. Any closing comments, thoughts, ideas as we wrap up? Kengor. Paul Kenger. He's a professor at Grove City College in Pennsylvania. But he is fantastic. Fantastic. So many. George Weigel.
How much information do you give now? Is that still proper faith for evangelization? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes. In fact, the church says, okay, on the natural realm, the public realm, common to all people, legislative process, right? That's how that gets dealt with, the moral order. But on the spiritual realm, the growth of the church cannot come by legislative enforcement. It has to come by evangelization. We cannot coerce people to believe. In fact, Benedict XVI gave that speech at Regensburg in 2006, where he said, there can be no compulsion in religion. But there can be compulsion in the natural realm, right? Because that's if I don't put my seatbelt on and I just decide I'm going to drive, right, I can get ticketed for that, right? So the state has the power to compel me. And we're fine with that, within reason, right? We get that. I can't drive drunk, right? That's all right. But we can't compel people to go to the adoration. Hey, you know what? We need doors at the adoration chapel. You sign up for an hour, right? Though if Father Shrebeth were king. By the way, there is a rumor that Father Shrebeth might be back next week, or at the very least, the following week. He has been at St. Jude for the last few weeks, covering for Father Daniel. So, all right. We'll close in a quick word of prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and never shall be, world without end. Amen. In Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. All right. The end stream, end stream, end stream, end stream.